The whole reason that we even lionize or popularize someone like a Martin Luther King, who, by the way, was an all-out Marxist, who didn't believe in God. He said so in his own papers, that he did not believe in the resurrection of the Christ. That's very strange for someone who professes to be a Christian pastor. He didn't write any of his speeches. His dissertation was plagiarized. Those in his inner circle, his speechwriters, were themselves communists. Stanley Levison was a treasurer for a communist front group in New York. Bayard Rustin was a communist. He's the one who taught Martin Luther King the strategy of nonviolence. He was a concoction.
But the reality is that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement served in America as a kind of Marxist Trojan horse. From the outside, it appeared to be moderate and pro-American, and it's for this reason that America accepted it. But when you look at the results that followed, which were intentional, an expanded government, various socialist policies, a heightened welfare state, the facts reveal that this wasn't ignorance, but malice. They quite literally wanted to Sovietize America. In a 1965 interview, Bettina Aptheker said that the American political landscape is the perfect one for communism because Americans believe that they live in a democracy.
Communist philosophy or socialism easily and has to adapt to the country in which it's taking place. In this country, there will never be socialism unless the overwhelming majority of the American people passionately want it, and want it so badly that they're going to go out and get it. It's one of the things that gets me so excited when I start thinking about the possibilities of socialism in this country. The civil rights movement has already begun to develop a certain program. It is revolutionary, and it is also, I think, much more democratic.
So you can democratize social issues, and you can, in a sense, pull out the heartstrings of America. They will then let their guard down, and they will democratize socialism into reality. And so I don't see Martin Luther King fighting against that. I see Martin Luther King as a participant in that, which is a subversive thing.
It seems to me that the civil rights movement must now begin to organize for the guaranteed annual income, begin to organize.
The question arises, well, what other options did he have? Well, for me, I think one of the reasons why there's such a mental block for people is because we've all went to the same schools. We all graduated from the same schools. We all read the same textbooks. You know, we all understand how MLK was this good moral leader who came to, in a sense, deconstruct the way things were. And there was no one else. No one else knew how to do it. But Martin Luther King, here's a guy who got it. And he was a Christian pastor, and he was all these things. Much of what we have learned about him turned out to be either false or inaccurate or, you know, a myth or what have you.
Dr. J.H. Jackson, head of the largest Negro church organization in America, the National Baptist Convention USA, with nearly 7 million members, has warned constantly that communists are directing the revolutionary activities of the radical black power.
There were other people like Joseph H. Jackson who believed in the fundamental Christian gospel, not the social gospel, not liberation theology, the fundamental Christian gospel, the inerrancy of the scriptures, the resurrection of Christ. Like, he believed in those things fundamentally.
What is your feelings toward the new black theology?
Those of us who are Christians, we don't believe that you can have a theory of God based on color. I don't believe.
When you look at his engagement in civil rights, it wasn't this same brand of civil rights that MLK was pushing, in that we vest certain unconstitutional powers in the federal government, which widens that power and, in a sense, usurps our rights as Americans. Because, you know, to Bob Woodson's point, we shouldn't have given the federal government the right to force businesses to integrate. Rather, we should have merely taken away the state's right to segregate.
Integration was never our goal. We never saw integration as a solution to the problems. We were seeking desegregation. And I think confusion on that point has continued to erode the collective self-confidence of the black community today. So integration was never an issue for me or for many others, but it was the issue that I think separated me from the civil rights movement.
Both the problem and MLK's solution are unconstitutional, says Bob Woodson, says Barry Goldwater, and many others, even Malcolm X, ironically.
Any effort to force integration upon whites is actually hypocritical. There's a form of hypocrisy involved. If a white man puts his arm around me voluntarily, that's brotherhood. But if you hold a gun on him and make him embrace me and pretend to be friendly or brotherly toward me, then that's not brotherhood, that's hypocrisy.
When I look at someone like a Joseph H. Jackson, he argued that to the extent that the white man doesn't give you a job, it's incumbent upon you to build your own businesses and to hire your brother and your sister and your neighbor, that you aren't begging someone else for a job. And so he didn't only talk about this, but he exemplified this. There were a bunch of sharecroppers in the South who were getting cheated by farmers. Jackson was the president of the National Baptist Convention. The convention bought 400 acres of farmland in the South, and they allowed these black sharecroppers to work the land for free. And to the extent that they raised money for their crops, they got to keep and pocket that money so long as they were saving that money to buy their own farmland, so they can move from sharecroppers to farmers and not have to depend on anybody else for their daily bread. The convention, under the behest of Jackson, did many of these things. Now, the reason why I bring up Jackson in comparison to Martin Luther King is because, as you know, Ebenezer Baptist Church was under the umbrella of the National Baptist Convention. Martin Luther King, fresh out of Crozer, very young, very ambitious, he wanted to be the president of the National Baptist Convention. He was overwhelmingly rejected, and it got pretty contentious. Someone was pushed off a stage and died. Someone from Martin Luther King's little ilk pushed this young man off the stage and he died. So it got pretty contentious, and they ended up kicking Martin Luther King and his friends out of the National Baptist Convention. This was before his face was plastered on Time magazine and all the rest of it. So what they decided to do, at the suggestion of Stanley Levison, was start a new Baptist convention which would rival the National Baptist Convention. So they started the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Of course, it didn't take off. It didn't do anything. So they started this Southern Leadership Conference, and then they moved from there to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and its concoction was the result of the fact that Martin Luther King and his campaign was not popular to these Negroes in the South as much as Joseph H. Jackson, who was a continuation of the kinds of things that Booker T. Washington talked about. Martin Luther King wanted to move the National Baptist Convention into a new, more radical, if I can use that word, social gospel, and to get away from the kind of fundamental gospel that Joseph H. Jackson and his ilk was preaching. He failed to do so, started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The advantage that Martin Luther King and his ilk had that Joseph H. Jackson did not have is that once the success of the Montgomery bus boycott took off and all the things, the media basically swarmed around Martin Luther King. They made him larger than life. Stanley Levison, who was a phenomenal publicist, he's the one who lined up the interviews, who was able to mobilize the media to put cameras in front of the civil rights movement under the behest of Martin Luther King, and the rest is history. And so Joseph H. Jackson was all but erased from these kinds of conversations that we talk about. It always comes down to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. The founding fathers were trying to wrestle away their right to independence, not by way of deception, but by way of laying it all out on the table. They issued a Declaration of Independence, said this is what we do not like about our leadership, about our government. And we are going, I don't believe that these individuals, the William Barbers, the Jesse Jacksons, the Al Sharptons, and others, I don't believe that they are a deviation from MLK, nor do I believe that they hijacked MLK or try to, in a sense, merely mimic MLK. I think that they are a continuation of MLK, and had MLK not been assassinated, he would have been doing the same things that Jesse Jackson and others were doing. The whole nonviolent thing is so brilliant. It's just so brilliant, because you build these kind of situations in these moments and you know what's going to happen. You know what's going to ensue. You do all of this knowing that the threat at the end of all of it is a riot, an all-out riot. And you can then use that as political fodder.
A riot is the language of the unheard. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
The whole point of nonviolence is you get people into the streets, you don't pull permits so that the traffic can be regulated and the noise can be controlled and all the things. You have these unlawful marches, and to the extent that the sheriff's department shows up and tries to remove you, If you aren't being compliant, you're continuing marching, then they have to necessarily remove you by force. And not only that, but a lot of these individuals who were a part of the marches weren't themselves Southerners. These were freedom riders and others who were coming down from the North, being agitative. When you look at what Jesse Jackson was doing in the 90s, where they were going to these predominantly white corporations that were situated in predominantly white areas, saying that they were discriminating because they don't have enough black employees. Again, these same kind of shakedown tactics that MLK was doing, so too was Jesse doing in the 90s. And so I don't know that MLK would have been displeased with what his proverbial sons were doing, because he was doing the same exact things. And not only that, philosophically, ideologically, he aligned with where these people are.
What we needed was a moderate presentation of the vision of the civil rights movement. That was orchestrated very beautifully by Bayard Rustin, and King put the icing on the cake with the I Have a Dream speech.
Dr. King, the deputy director of the march, the man who is credited in Life magazine with being the one who thought it up in the first place, is named Bayard Rustin. Rustin admits that he is a former member of the Communist League. Do you feel confident that he is qualified in every way to lead this movement?
I think Mr. Rustin is as committed to American democracy and as committed to the ideals of democracy as anyone at this time.
With almost surgical precision, with the help of the mainstream media, they managed to redirect the trajectory of our country down this road toward globalism and Marxism. Now, these Marxian leftists get to decide to what degree is one living up to this dream or not.
These Memphis second graders are keeping his legacy alive.
School children are impacted by these new Marxist gatekeepers and interpreters insofar that they have their hands in public school curriculum. And so when we look at what's going on in Florida right now, what we see is that any curriculum that does not have the blessing of these gatekeepers are demonized as anti-progress and a threat to MLK's so-called dream. For example, Spike Lee literally said, by virtue of Florida passing this curriculum, that's an example of us not living up to Martin Luther King's dream.
We're trying to aspire to a dream.
And he's right. Like, people don't understand how right he is. When you understand the nefarious means by which that speech came to existence to begin with, quoting that speech as though it's this kind of monumental, kind of sacred document.
50 years ago,
one of the tactics communists would use is they would oftentimes try and co-opt the legacies of America's figures.
A great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today.
One of their tactics was to try and connect their point of view and their motives to men like Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, as opposed to, say, Marx, Engels, Lenin. Make it seem as though you are in line and in lockstep with the American tradition. There's a difference in what the founders were doing and what King was doing. King was a direct betrayal of our founding values, and he knew that. He was very conscious of that.
People should ask themselves, why his dream? Why his vision? Out of all the pastors in America, why is it that Martin Luther King's dream was the one that was chosen to be the one that will be the new kind of founding document of modern America? It wasn't that he was especially more moral than other pastors. We know that Martin Luther King was a perpetual drug user and a serial adulterer. We also know from his personal papers that he wasn't really a Christian. He didn't even believe that Jesus rose from the dead, which is a basic tenet of Christianity. This is precisely the reason why Martin Luther King was placed on a pedestal by the mainstream media, who themselves were secular progressives who hated religion. If you're a Christian, we have the Bible. We have the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said that, do unto others as you will have them do unto you. Like, we have the perfect teacher.
As we follow this form of mass action and strategic nonviolence, we will not only put pressure on the government, but we will put pressure on other groups which ought by their nature to be allied with us.
Here's the fact of the matter. When it comes to the question of what does it take for a black person to be successful in America, black conservatives in particular have been strategically cut out of the conversation for a very long time.
I haven't even finished the sentence. How am I making light of anything?
With some bullshit.
Okay.
This is due to the fact that we love this country and the fact that we embrace Western civilization.
Why don't you like using African American?
Because as I trace my roots back in this country, yes, many of the slaves came from Africa, but my heritage is mostly here in the United States, so I prefer the term Black American rather than African American.
Western civilization is not a white construct, regardless of how much the intelligentsia beats that into your head.
In the United States, the culture, the set of legal practices, those categorized as white, are always at the top.
This country is founded on freedom and justice and life and liberty to all. It was never intended for the black body.
This type of rhetoric serves as an otherization tactic. In other words, it makes black people feel other than, as though we don't have a stake in Western civilization, as though we are separate from Western civilization. But this particular talking point is peddled by black race hustlers who claim that black people who embrace the American idea are sellouts, coons, Uncle Toms, and the like.
He was an Uncle Tom. What did you mean by that?
The people I represent have a real issue with an African American not being sensitive to those issues.
Calling him an Uncle Tom, though, that certainly wouldn't be, appropriate if it was coming from somebody who was white.
But I'm black.
These progressives purposefully want black people and other minorities to feel as though we don't belong here and as though we don't own anything here, because when you can keep people in that state of mind, you can rely upon them to reap havoc anytime you're wanting to push some kind of social policy or to elect some candidate.
There is a discrimination against blacks and against women in our present system, since not all blacks will be superior.
Even though this small select group of white Marxian elitists are responsible for birthing and peddling this kind of rhetoric, they are masters at projecting the idea of "we don't want you here" on white middle Americans, white Southerners, white working class people, and in so doing create friction between ordinary white people and ordinary black people.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
The key to their success is black people who do not think for themselves. They don't want black people thinking for themselves, because if they do, then they would be in trouble and out of a job. And so my position is, if your winning strategy is to continue to squeeze me out of the conversation by claiming that black conservatives suck up to white people, then I can name the individuals and I can name the organizations who are giving Hank Rogers his ideas, who is giving LeBron James his ideas, who is giving Whoopi Goldberg her ideas. You'll notice that I keep saying ideas. This is because ideas should be judged based on their merits, not based on the skin color of the person who possesses them. And so if you tell me falsely that I'm sucking up to white people, and I can actually give receipts of how you are actually sucking up to white people, and we can get that mess out of the way, now let's have a conversation based on the actual ideas and whether or not those ideas are good for people or bad for people. It takes nothing more than a brief reading of basic history to see that Marxist ideas are bad for people. On the other hand, America, which is pretty much a capitalist country, attracts the most immigrants of any other country in the world.
From this day forward, each of you is a citizen of the United States of America. Congratulations.
Even for the few black conservatives who are trying to please white conservatives, when you listen to how white conservatives talk, most of them just want to mind their own business and do their own thing, take care of their families, conserve their communities, conserve their businesses, conserve what they have going for them. That's not too much to ask. Anybody of any ethnic background should want the same thing. When you listen to, on the other hand, how white progressives who are supposed to care about everybody talk about black people,
they're less likely to have state IDs.
They don't have the knowledge of how it works. They don't really know what is out there just because they're not aware or they're not informed.
We have to be a lot more intentional when it comes to black Americans.
When you see a black person being pulled over, stop, film. It's the only way we're going to start saving these people.
It's always as if we are special needs. Well, what about black unemployment? Oh, they're trying to suppress the black vote. Black people can't get IDs. It is very peculiar how they talk about black people, not as if we're people, but as if we're projects, and that it's up to them to do our thinking for us. And so when it comes to black liberals, I don't understand how you listen to the way that these white liberals talk about you and not get the feeling that they see you as lesser than.
As white folks, our challenge is to constantly be figuring out how to take actions that make it clear that this environment needs to be safer for people of color.
They present themselves to you as your savior, and you're all too willing to take that subordinate role. But what is your deficiency, really? I'm sure you think that you're smart enough. I'm sure that you think that you're able enough. And so what is it?
Is it your skin color? Do you really believe that your skin color is a deficiency? Do you really believe that your skin color makes you lesser than or inferior to others? Just some things to consider.